Well, good morning if you are in Los Angeles, California. Good afternoon if you're in Houston, Texas, or New York City, all great cultural capitals and places with famous opera companies. Good evening to people listening in Europe, in Africa, overnight in Asia, all around the world. Who should we shout out to tonight? Hello, people in Sri Lanka. I know we have listeners there, and I've not acknowledged you yet, so greetings in Sri Lanka. Welcome to Fred Plotkin on Fridays on Adagio, the place where classical music happens. As you know, Adagio is a video and audio streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and to bringing classical music and opera to music lovers all around the world. My guest today joins me from Houston, Texas, Josh Winograde, who is, you will tell me your title in a moment because it's a multifaceted role that you have at Rice University in the Shepherd School, which is a very famous, I don't know if you call it school, a conservatory for opera and music in general. What do you do, and what's the official title? What's the official name of the school?
Well, thank you for having me, and it's a pleasure to be here. My title at Rice is Professor of Opera and Director of Opera Studies. The way that I describe it to people is that the degree that the singers earn when they attend Rice, whether it's a bachelor's degree, master's degree, or artist diploma, or a doctorate, in fact, is awarded through the School of Music, and the way that I describe it in completely wrong terms, but it's easiest to understand, is that until 3 p.m. they're all in the School of Music studying the curriculum designed to get them the degree that they've signed up to achieve. And then at 3 p.m., they walk into the Opera House and we do productions and we have classes and we have career seminars and we have a whole second curriculum that is specific to opera. That is not the entity that awards their degree, but is, as you and I both know, when singers decide to pursue multiple degrees in voice, typically the part of it that they're most interested in is opera. Of course, there are a lot of students interested in song and interested in teaching and things like that, but at Rice, the majority of our students have been bitten by the opera bug.
So I have to say in full disclosure that there are, to my count, only 4 major opera houses in the world where I've never seen an opera. And one of them is Glyndebourne in England.
Okay.
I've worked for them, but I've just never seen opera there. Another is the Bolshoi in Moscow, where I've seen a ballet, but I've never seen an opera. Another is the Opera House in Sydney, where I was supposed to work in the fall of 2001, but we had 9/11 here in New York, and that's the only time I've canceled the contract, but I felt it was important to stay in New York. And the last one, to my regret, is I've never been to Houston, Texas. I've been to Texas a fair amount. I've worked in different arts organizations throughout the state, but I just have not been to Houston. I'm not avoiding it, I assure you. But I know Houston Grand Opera to be one of the finest, most innovative companies we have in America that's presented many world premieres. It has a wonderful studio for Houston Grand Opera students, and I've worked with and known so many people who've come out of that studio. A number of years ago, I worked with a woman, not in Houston, because I've never been, named Lois Alba. I don't know if you've ever come across her. And we were somewhere in Europe, I think Spain, if I remember. And there's an organization called Opera in the Heights, which is also in Houston. And I gather it's a wonderful company. And then
Fabulous.
the third pole of the Opera Triumvirate in Houston is your school at Rice University. And people I know who talk about Houston and going to opera and seeing opera and learning opera in Houston factor in all 3. So you bring me, please, and also our listeners around the world. How accurate is that description, and what am I missing about Houston?
No, well, first of all,
Oh,
let me say that sorry, we had a little glitch in our connection, but I think we're caught up. Um, Let me just say that as you mentioned your list of four major houses you've never been to, I can't believe there's one thing in this, with your accomplishments and everything you've done in the opera industry, that I just have to brag a little. I've been to all four of those houses, Fred.
wow.
Um,
Have you ever been to opera in Iceland?
you
I worked
win, you
on
win, you win.
I worked on a ring production there years ago. Best
Um,
cast call for Valkyries anywhere was in Iceland.
Well, you're right, that Houston is an unbelievably special place and punches way above its weight as a kind of cultural mecca. Those of us that live here are not surprised by that at all. So my introduction to Houston was in 2000 when I won a spot through the competition that they host every year, which is the Concert of Arias, that used to be, or maybe still is, the McCollum competition at Houston Grand Opera. And through that competition, I won a spot in the Young Artist Program. So for 3 years, I was an apprentice in the Houston Grand Opera Young Artist Program, now called the Butler Studio. And so I moved to Houston in 2000 for 3 years. And I will say I had always, of course, known about the Houston Grand Opera and the Houston Symphony. I am embarrassed to say that I only learned about the unbelievable fine arts, visual arts scene here, whether it's the Museum of Fine Arts, the Manil Collection, an enormous number of museums that are not arts based specifically, like the Natural Sciences and Holocaust Museum, et cetera. Um, I'll also say that I didn't know when I moved here that there was a secondary opera company, Opera in the Heights, which is spectacular, as you mentioned. There are whether it's Mercury Chamber Orchestra, which used to be called Mercury Baroque, but they've since expanded. Whether it's the River Oaks Chamber Orchestra, there are. I'm embarrassed to say, but by the way, there's the Houston Ballet, a world class company.
That's
Um, Now, I believe. Um, Run still by Stanton Welch, but also maybe by Julie Kent, legendary dancer. So, um, you know, those of us that live in Houston, we are aware of the embarrassment of riches that we have on the cultural scene here. In fact, I say that I've never, and this includes having lived in LA and New York for each half my life before moving here. Um, I've never experienced such FOMO on a daily basis of the amount of concerts I just can't make it to, that open and close before I can even get there. Oh, and by the way, I feel I would be remiss to not mention that there are two extensive musical theater programs here. So there's constantly touring shows coming in, and locally produced shows. So Houston.
and Josh, I want to point out to listeners abroad, especially in Sri Lanka, what FOMO is: fear of missing out.
Right. Sorry. Yeah. I'm just so hip. I use the vernacular without realizing it. No, not true. But so when I had an opportunity to come back to Houston many years later, now this time with a family, two little kids, I was able to envision very clearly, having been here as a young adult myself. I was able to really clearly envision what like a very high quality life might be like in Houston, that was very rich in the performing and visual arts, and especially through the eyes of kids, being exposed to all that. And everything's just so easy, I mean, the example I use, which is really reductive and simple, but you'll know what I mean when I say it, is that if there's anything we want to do, whether it's a museum or a performance or whatever, there's always, a ticket, and there's always a parking space right in front. And those two conveniences, are hard to come by, and in Houston, it's just that way. So we're loving it. I know I got off topic from your question, but
No, it's about the city where your
yeah,
school resides and grew in.
yeah. And so to talk a little bit about, Rice, you mentioned music school or conservatory. It is the Shepherd School of Music. I use the word conservatory loosely, not really knowing, the kind of major distinctions between School of Music and conservatory that would be, you know, that would be distinguishing in a substantial way. But it really feels like a conservatory at the Shepherd School of Music. Having I got 2 degrees as an alum of the Juilliard School, and so I know about a conservatory, and I loved the conservatory environment. And I think what makes Rice so special, among many other things, is that we are a conservatory inside this unbelievably accomplished and exciting university. So it feels like we have the ability to kind of incubate within our own laboratory spaces, our own theater venues, our own classrooms as a conservatory, the way I did at Juilliard. But at the same time, there's all these exciting things happening on the Rice campus in the fields of biological sciences, medical innovations, architecture, art history. I mean, it's just.
I'm actually going to have you pause on that. As I said, I've never been to Houston, but when we in the Northeast talk about schools outside of the Northeast that are considered really good universities, private universities, you might hear Duke in North Carolina, Vanderbilt in Tennessee, and obviously Caltech and Stanford in California. And you always hear Rice mentioned in Texas. And I'm very familiar with, I've known many brilliant people have come out of there, not in music, but also music. I've worked with some of the people who've graduated from your school. But it sounds like the academic level is very high. So that even, within the context, Juilliard is a conservatory. It's dedicated to the performing arts. But your university has disciplines for other people. And your music students can touch and meet people from those disciplines. And I find that very exciting.
That's right, and I want to point out something else that's interesting, which was unexpected to me in a very exciting way, and different. Is because the Shepherd School of Music at Rice University has university-wide academic requirements. One thing that I did not experience, that I don't know if it's a priority at Juilliard, Curtis, Colburn School, other places, very specifically conservatory. I don't know if the academic requirements are as rigorous, and so it's in a way it's a double-edged sword, although I always try to see, maybe that's the wrong phrase. There are advantages and disadvantages, which are sometimes an unbelievably talented young singer who I'm just so excited about, had other focuses in their undergraduate and is not going to achieve a GPA to qualify for admission to a graduate studies program at Rice University, and
GPA being grade point average.
Thank you. And I'll try to remember that some of the abbreviations are idiosyncratic to us, but but at the same time, then the students who do qualify academically for admission to Rice University and artistically for admission to the Shepherd School of Music, we have just this really, really smart, really exciting bunch of students every year.
So I wasn't planning on going this direction, but I will. I know you're from Los Angeles. I know you worked at the Los Angeles Opera. I, in my past, worked there a lot. It's one of the companies I worked at most and love it, and I'm very familiar with it. And one of the things that they had me do for many years was to come to Los Angeles for 2 or 3 weeks and have a residency and teach. And I would teach different populations, little kids, high school kids, audiences attending the performance, the board, and also at Caltech. Caltech being one of the great technology and science and design universities in the world. And I loved it because the students were brilliant and very open. And what I would do with them is I would send an opera ahead of time and ask them to study the opera and think about it and design a production, even if they were not production designers, and solve the solutions. And I think of the ones I sent, my favorite was Otello, because I got Placido Domingo to come talk to them about Otello, which they loved, and how to solve the problems of that show, such as a ship arriving and a plank coming down and storms and everything that you would have to do that you and I growing up in opera learned the tricks for, but I wanted to see what these great technological and scientific minds would do, and they were fabulous.
Yeah.
Um, so my question is, I know that Rice has a lot of these brilliant scientific students. Has the Shepherd School, especially the opera division, engaged with them in any way to see how they develop production ideas and creative ideas for the stage?
It's a great question, and I know that we have at Rice. I know that I feel like I'm you know speaking effusively and hyperbolically, but I have to just be honest that I love it here so much that I tend to get very excited and very dramatic when I praise my employer. But we have this really inspirational president, Reggie DeRoche, and he has unveiled a 10-year plan of growth and development, and interdepartmental collaboration is absolutely a part of that plan. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how. I just arrived at Rice fairly recently. There are some ideas that I certainly have, which I'd be happy to talk to you about. First and foremost, we have a really, really it's a Division I sports program, and we have just these incredible superstars who are teaching not just on the like field level, but also on sports management and sports psychology. And that's the part I was going to mention now, which is when I was a student at Juilliard, we had renowned sports and performing arts psychologist Dawn Green come in and do a bunch of classes for us in the ways in which we can use the study of athletics as performing artists to kind of harness all those brainstem responses, the fight and flight responses, the fear, the anxiety, the sweating skin, all those things that our body does when we are faced with stress, the screaming of the crowd, anything that happens, which of course happens more in athletics than in opera until the very end. But
I've heard the crowd scream in opera.
Yeah. Typically they wait for the right moment, but
and throwing shoes. One time when I worked at the Met in a production of Verdi's Macbeth,
right,
everyone took off their shoes and threw them at the stage. I'm not kidding.
So right then and there, like my mind went to what are the ways in the future, and of course, this is in the super nascent stages of my brain, but what are the ways in which even the sports management and sports psychologists at Rice, can come in and work with the singers on getting their mind right for the game.
If I may, let me ask you a question on that. I'm sorry to interrupt, but this pops to mind. I wonder whether a sports psychologist working with a singer or musician, I love baseball. It's my favorite sport, but I also like sports that are individual, such as swimming and diving or tennis. And I wonder whether a sports psychologist would bring the psychology of team sports, soccer, football, basketball, hockey, baseball, or individual pursuits like running, swimming, diving, tennis. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think, you're certainly right that, the major difference between what an opera singer goes through and what an athlete might go to, especially a team athlete, is that when you're in an opera, presumably you've rehearsed so much that you know what's going to happen. So in that way, what we're doing on the stage does more closely resemble the routine of a gymnast or the dive of a diver, something that they've rehearsed so much that they intend to get perfect in front of you. And so in that regard, when you're one of a dozen teammates and there's another dozen opposing teammates on the same court or field, and there are surprises coming at you, people doing things that are not part of what you practiced, and it requires a certain nimbleness. However, I would say that in opera, as you and I both know, and we've all been in the audience, or in my case, also on stage, when something goes wrong, someone jumps a verse, somebody, you forget your own words.
Yeah.
Your costume gets stuck in a doorway and you say, I can't get to where I need to be, in the next 3 seconds. So what do I do? So the idea that there are techniques that anybody can use, regardless of whether opera represents baseball, resembles baseball versus diving. The idea is that psychologists who are trained in how to get your mind ready for whatever is thrown at it in order for you to deliver the performance you've rehearsed.
Hmm.
Um, I think it applies, regardless of the endeavor.
You remind me of something else. You're talking about Juilliard. When in the past I taught at Juilliard, I still do occasionally, but in the past, when the president of the school was Dr. Joseph Polizzi, Dr. Polizzi was a wonderful man, um, loves music, loves the arts. He also loves baseball.
Hmm.
And if he discovers that you love baseball, you form a different kind of relationship with him. And it's my favorite sport. And one time I was in his office and he had a baseball bat for the Yankees, which are his team. And we were talking about baseball. And apparently I crossed the threshold of his approval. And he opened his drawer and he gave me something. He said, "This is for you." And it's a hat. It's a baseball cap, dark blue. And it said, "Juilliard Athletics, undefeated since 1905. That's because Juilliard does not have sports teams.
I'm about
You
20
have
feet.
one too?
I'm about 20 feet away from my Juilliard Athletics t-shirt.
Okay, so you understand. But
Yeah.
but I'm going to go back generations actually. There have always been opera singers who are very physically fit and very aware of their bodies. It's not just recent times. And the stereotype of the fat opera singer is the stereotype there are heavy people who sing opera and heavy people who don't sing opera. And but one of the ones I worked with at the beginning of my career and well into my career because she lasted so long was the opera singer Roberta Peters, who was a very pretty woman. She was very professional. She had a lovely voice. She remained very youthful and very physical, well beyond the years that her roles indicated, because she sang a lot of girlfriend roles and so on, Ina roles, soubrette roles. And she maintained her physical fitness beautifully and colored her hair and so on. And she was gorgeous and could sing beautifully, but they didn't cast her for things anymore. And I asked her, "What is the secret of your physical fitness?" She studied Pilates,
Hmm.
the science of fitness, with Mr. Pilates,
Oh.
the man who invented Pilates. She studied Pilates with him. And she was an advocate for Pilates and for physical fitness. And when I saw her teach young artists, she immediately went to the physicality of their performance. And I don't just mean where to have technique and how to hold your head, but the actual physical fitness. And she believed that if you could do that, you could do much more on the opera stage.
Yeah.
Is physical fitness at Shepherd at Rice part of the curriculum, part of the discipline?
It's not. I feel that singers, by the time they get to a place like Rice, where they're interested in taking what we offer so seriously, they have already made a commitment to the connection between their body and their vocal instrument. The indistinguishableness of and it surprises a lot of people that when we have parents of students or when we have guests watch some of what we do, whether it's a rehearsal or a master class, who are not super familiar with the training that an opera singer goes through, they are shocked to hear how much of the conversation in those settings is about the whole body. You might think, you know, I'm just making a silly analogy, the first one that pops in my head, but you might think that if you're talking about, a painter, that you would be focusing on everything from the elbow through the tip of the brush, and it might shock you, to go to a art studio and hear people talking about the rest of the body. And so so the same thing applies with singing, as you know very, very well, that the entire body goes into supporting the amount of sound you're producing. And I think that this is an interesting opportunity to say, although I'm going off on a major tangent here, I hope you don't mind. I think
Go
that
for it.
one of the questions I field most is what about a singer would allow us to call them an opera singer and someone else not an opera singer? And I think that there's a really important distinguishing characteristic, because there's a lot of really unbelievable people out there who make very viable operatic quality sounds who I don't consider to be opera singers. And that's not in any way a disparaging or a judgmental remark. It's just I don't. And why don't I? It's because I think the absolute fundamental requirement is that you train your voice in order to be able to make enough unamplified sound. That's a real key, unamplified sound. Now, there are a lot of composers, especially contemporary ones, writing music for amplified voice. Fine, they're incredible compositions, and that's wonderful. Then there are also a lot of places like some of these larger arenas where they perform operas where the singers have to be mic'd. Nonetheless, even when they're mic'd, they are trained in a way to produce enough volume, unamplified, to fill upwards of 3,000 seats in an acoustically, strategic venue. So there's a lot of singers out there whose albums I own, who I listen to in my car and in my, app, my ear, whatever pods, buds, walking to work every day, who I admire very, very much. Super famous names, Tony winners, Grammy winners, who, I would never call opera singers because the first thing, the fundamental criteria that they do not, the threshold that they don't pass right away is that they've not trained their instrument to make that amount of volume to carry through that amount of space unamplified. So
I agree with you 150,000%.
yeah.
That's a distinction I make. I want to just add to that you and I are accustomed to hearing people in live spaces. For many people, when they're hearing opera singers, they're hearing them on recordings, they're hearing them in live HD transmissions, on video of different kinds. In other words, where the sound has been recorded or is being transmitted in some way. Now, even if there's not a studio technician turning a dial or correcting or sweetening a sound, the way we interact, you with your earbuds, me perhaps watching a video, is different than the sensation, the vibration, and there is a vibration that comes with live sound. I can recall many singers whom I've heard, mostly dramatic sopranos, but not only, who just have a particular vibration. I can think of contraltos. I'll name a few voices of different types. Luciano Pavarotti, absolutely. Hildegard Behrens, absolutely. Joan Sutherland, Birgit Nielsen, absolutely. But also Marilyn Horne, Stephanie Blythe, in different vocal categories, but they have this particular vibration that just feels fantastic in the theater when you're a listener. Bryn Tervel, James Morris, there are many, which we just simply don't get on recorded sound. To that, I'm further going to add that I am very admiring of singers, not opera singers, who learn how to sing properly with a microphone. And I'll point out three, let's say. There was Ella Fitzgerald, who was just the best at everything, and she understood how her voice was received in the microphone, and she could improvise with the band behind her in the moment, no matter what was going on. There was Frank Sinatra, who tended to have his vocal arrangements done ahead of time and his orchestral arrangements done ahead of time. And he stood at the microphone in such a way that the balance and the integration of his voice with the musicians behind him worked perfectly for a very packaged, very polished performance. And the third is Tony Bennett, who drew from both of those. And he could do what Ella Fitzgerald did to some degree, and he could also do what Frank Sinatra did to some degree. And those, to me, are three paragons. They're hardly the only ones, but many of the Barbra Streisand knows how to sing with a microphone. And what's interesting with her, I've heard her once in an arena of 19,000 people, and I have a decibel meter on my phone, and she's a perfectionist. It never went above 70 decibels, which is the ideal number. Whereas I heard Charles Aznavour, Diana Ross, many other people, where it got so incredibly loud it was distorted. But Streisand, even in a space of 19,000 people, kept it perfect. And that's knowledge, and that's a certain kind of obsessiveness that I love, actually. And I think that with opera singers, they need to understand the thinking behind that, but not to imitate it, because I would rather that they listen to natural sound, and they too are working with a conductor who may be in front of them rather than behind them, which is the case with a lot of popular singers. What do you think?
Well, I think, it's interesting. I have a lot of experience having produced operas in which microphones were necessary based on the venue or based on the composition. There are a lot of well-known contemporary works in which having microphones is essential to the viability of the piece. And then there are also times where we present historically unamplified works in venues that just, like the number of operas I've seen the LA Phil do at Hollywood Bowl, where the singers just have, it's 15,000 seats outdoors. You need some mics. And in all those instances that I can think of, interestingly enough, I've been a part of, a number of recording projects, but never like, those, when you see those videos of operas having been recorded in the recording studios, I've never been in the room with those. But when I've been in the room, either with these amplified performances or with these recording projects, the one thing that the engineers that I've heard almost all of them say is, you just sing the way you sing, and I bear the responsibility of figuring of capturing this in the right way. And so in that regard, you bring up an interesting point. It's a question that I've not really thought of until you just said what you said, and it's making me think, I wonder if microphone techniques needs to be a part of a curriculum for opera singers, or if we just say that will always be the responsibility of the recording engineer or the audio engineer in whatever project you're doing, and you just sing the way you sing. But the one thing I'm 100% certain about is that the training that goes into singing operas in order to make your career have the longevity you wish, have the repertoire diversity if that's part of your goal, whatever it is, the training that goes into it must be an unamplified training, because if you if you train the mechanism to be able to make the kind of intimate sounds that a microphone will pick up at any kind of small decibel, I don't know how you transition to the opera space. Now, having said that, I want to point out that I have a glaring example of me being wrong, which is the incomparable Kelly O'Hara, who goes back and forth between the Metropolitan Opera unamplified and Broadway with enormous success. So there is, rather than saying that as a rule I'm wrong, I'm only willing to go so far as to say I'm aware of one exception.
I could probably think of a couple of more, but you're absolutely right
Sure.
about Kelly O'Hara. I would add too that there are a lot of terrible opera recordings, not because of the performances by the singers and the orchestra and the conductor, but what happened in the studio. Either because they mucked up something good, or they thought that they had to make a change. A lot of it relates to where you record it. So the Met for a number of years recorded in a particular space on the west side of Manhattan with mostly Deutsche Grammophon, and they figured out what they liked, along with James Levine, who usually was the conductor. But So if you had an Aida with Dolores Sacha, Caprile Milo, and Placido Domingo, you have a great cast, a great conductor, a great orchestra, but you may not get the breadth of sound that you could get inside the theater. Levine once told me that he conducted his recording of Parsifal the way he imagined that Wagner heard it in the Festspielhaus in Bayreuth, and that he would not make that recording until he conducted Parsifal in Bayreuth. So it was not necessarily Levine's preferred version. It was not Levine's Metropolitan Opera version. It was very specifically the way Wagner would have played it in Bayreuth. And a lot of people don't like that recording, frankly. I do, but I can understand how other recordings of Parsifal might be more to other people's liking because they don't understand what Levine was after. A number of years ago, 84, 85, something like that, no, 88, worked for Decca, London Records, in Bologna, Italy. And there was a church there that they would do a lot of recordings of using local orchestras but international stars. And we did Puccini's Manon Lescaut with Kiri Takano and Jose Carreras. And it sounded great in the church, but somehow the compression that they did when they recorded it, it's not the best recording. And it's not because of Takano and Carreras. It's because of the way the sound was, quote, translated. So I always defined opera and video, opera and HD, and recordings as other people's interpretations of what happened musically. It's kind of like going back to sports, that when you watch a baseball game, let's say, on television, the cameraman and the director have decided what you see. So that if you want to watch the pitcher and the catcher, but they decide you should look at the first baseman and the runner on first base, you have no choice in that. And opera and HD, if they've decided that you should look at the soprano when you want to be looking at the tenor, you have no choice in that. And the sound is different. So it's a long way of saying that there's nothing like live performance of opera.
It's true, but as you first of all, before I say what I was going to say, I want to say I'm not on Facebook very often, but you and I are friends on Facebook, and one of my favorite things is seeing the incredible Italian meals you cook. So hearing that you lived in Bologna is the explanation to why there's always an incredible plate of pasta on your Facebook page. Anyway, you know, when you were talking about the different experiences people have with operas in different formats, it kind of, made me think of a whole bunch of things. First of all, it made me think of the fact that, I just can't help but wonder. I don't have any answers to the following statements. They're just my stream of consciousness. I can't help but wonder, for the composers who wrote works after, 1905 or 1910 or whenever recorded opera started. I may be wrong about the dates, but whatever the dates are, it's probably around there, right?
There.
Yeah. Did those composers write works knowing that there was going to be preservation of these operas in a way that the composers, even writing 10 years prior to that, had no, real way of imagining we were going to record them? So did they write their music differently? But then the other thing that I thought of is kind of the beauty of this art form is I've gone to see some of the HD transmissions in the movie theater where I hear people near me saying, I love coming to the theater because I love coming to the movie theater because in the acoustic theater, it's not so loud and visceral. I can't feel the bass and the cello in my chest the way I can in the movie theater. Or when the soprano, when soprano hits the B natural, I can't feel it in my brain the way I do in the movie theater, and then for other people, it's 100%. And I admit, because I love the kind of acoustic live presentation so much, that I'm with you in the live in the theater. That's what it's for. Some people are, don't go to the theater very often and are exclusively recording based. But I think that, how lucky are we that we have all of these options for people, so that no matter how they wish to experience, our art form, which we acknowledge, has a way of as a way of providing an experience unlike any other form we're aware of for certain people who love it, like us, that we have a variety of ways to experience it.
It reminds me in a way of something that you'll understand, and so will listeners. Um, for many years, I still see her occasionally. There's a now elderly blind lady who goes to the Metropolitan Opera a lot with her dog, and she sits very close to the stage. And I once asked her, wouldn't it be more convenient for you and the dog to be able to come out, sitting in the middle section somewhere where you can get out more easily? She said, absolutely not. When I sit close, I feel the vibrations on my face of what the singers are doing. And I feel it. I take my shoes off and I feel my feet feel the vibrations. And she said, and my dog feels the vibration. And my dog loves Mozart. My dog gets upset at Richard Strauss. And she has to give something calming to the dog for Richard Strauss.
That's so funny.
There's too many notes and too much going on. But to answer your other thing, it's a great question about whether composers change their composition based on technology. And I guess I would first look at Puccini, because Wagner was into technology and advancements and so on, but it was Puccini who loved technology. He had many cars. He nearly died in a car crash. He had one of the first telephones in Italy. And the problem was he had no one to call. So he would call the United States. And RCA was recording Caruso with Toscanini here in New York. And there were two invitations to Puccini in 1907 and 1910 to come to the Met. And he supervised performances here, and he made recordings. He went often to RCA and recorded his voice and attended recordings. And that was 1910. Then came World War I. And I would imagine that, he was composing Il Trittico and then Turandot, that he had a lot of that in mind. And had he lived longer than I think he was in his early 60s when he died, it would have been fascinating to see. I think maybe other composers, not so much Richard Strauss, Alban Berg, the other composers of the time, until maybe the post-war era. And then they would have been a lot more cognizant of it.
Yeah.
Bernstein, people like that. But I think Puccini would have been the exception had he lived. He would have composed for electronics. So I have what might be an indelicate question, but I'm asking it anyway.
Yeah.
Nowadays, we're going back to teaching singing and singers who teach singing. And I'm not advocating one way or the other, but there is a different discussion of the human body. There's a different physicality about the way opera singing is taught. I can think of 3 veteran singers, 2 of them, I think, still alive, 1 of them no longer, all women, 2 sopranos, 1 mezzo, who are very tactile in their teaching. And to bring out whatever she wanted to bring out from a singer, male or female, would touch in places that might be considered inappropriate nowadays, in the past too. But I think that the pedagogy of singing has changed to be more descriptive and less tactile. What do you think?
Well, look, going back to our athletics comparison, I think that, when I was it's not something I ever pursued professionally, but when I was much younger, I studied ballet, and there were times when the teachers would have to show you where on your foot they that the turnout was necessary, or where the point needed to start, or and so and I'm guessing that I've seen videos of Olympic gymnasts rehearsing with spotters, grabbing, so I know that the idea of needing to show somebody where on their body something is coming from, with the appropriate consent with a coach that you trust, I would imagine that that still very much has a place. I would imagine that, for example, there are certain places on the back I've seen teachers where they instruct students to use their own hands to feel movement as their lungs are
Wow.
expanding and contract, but then there are certain places like, where if you were to use your own hand to straighten out your posture, you might mess something up, and somebody else's hand to remind you might help. We have entire techniques like Alexander techniques, like Pilates that you mentioned earlier in our conversation, where instructors are physically manipulating their student or their artist or their athlete to be able to instruct. But I think that as always, the artist should be the one that remains the powerful person in this endeavor. I always tell singers, that this idea. Young singers tend to walk into a room and say, I'm going to show you what I do, and then you just let me know everything you think. And I always say, it's appropriate, especially by the time you've come to a place like Rice, where I teach, it's especially appropriate for a singer to feel like they know enough about what they're doing already to treat it a little bit more like a doctor's appointment. For example,
Ah.
you would never go to the doctor's appointment. Well, maybe you do for your annual physical, but you would never go and say, I'm just going to sit here. You let me know what's wrong. Instead, you walk in and you say, Doctor, my elbow hurts. You know, and so I think, for a singer to feel empowered to walk into a room and say, I'm struggling maintaining the top of my register, or I'm being told by coaches that I'm out of tune in the middle of the voice. It is okay to walk into a room and say, here's what I need to fix today, or these last few weeks, I notice I've been getting very tight in my jaw halfway through an aria, and so it's appropriate, I think, for singers to be more proactive, be more authoritative in the pursuit of their own development. And so in that regard, I think back to your question of whether the teaching techniques, first of all, there are certain teachers who I think are very largely physical. There are certain teachers, I had teachers say things to me like, think of that sound as more the color blue. And I didn't have any idea what that meant. But to another singer who's able to think in color, maybe that meant something. I was always a singer who responded very positively to someone saying, back of your head needs to be up higher, relax your jaw, and those are the things that helped me, a very kind of athletic, physical approach to what I was doing. So I think as long as the singer stays in control of their experience, or at least remains the most authoritative person in the room in their own
Mhm.
experience, which is empowering. And I think as long as there is consent and as long as there is an understanding that I, would like a certain kind of instruction, I think I've seen teachers employ very old-fashioned techniques that involve a lot of physical manipulation. And I've seen a lot of teachers who have developed their technique to be mostly verbal.
There's a related question to this that I didn't think to ask before, but I'll ask it now. Again, about teaching young singers about performance, but in this case, more what I do, which has been coaching on the theatrical aspects of a role. That if a young person is 23, 25, they may not have the life experience that a particular character they're performing would have. And even if that character is 23, like Violetta or
Right.
Madame Butterfly, not that we'd have young artists doing Madame Butterfly, but um, or Mimi even, who's a young woman, but they may not have that experience. And not just women, men as well. How many bass baritones could channel Don Giovanni? And you're a bass baritone, but how many could do that? Maybe you could, I don't know, but that's not the point. But you have to sort of awaken in them what this is about, and you hear it first in the music. You also find the libretto, you find it in the sculpture, in the paintings of the time, you find it in the literature of the time that the opera is from. But at some point, I, as the teacher director, am prevented or circumscribed in what I can talk about in terms of things like mores, sexuality, and so on, because of our modern times. And I'm not saying that's good or bad. I'm just saying that if I'm trying to awaken in somebody a role, and let's say Elsa in Lohengrin, or Lohengrin in Lohengrin, which is a very confusing role. How far can a teacher or a director go now
Well,
without stepping over a line? And I don't
right.
mean touching in any way. I mean discussion.
Yeah. There are two things I'd like to say in response to that. One is I'd like to give a shout out to one of the most important mentors. There have been so many, but one that occurred to me, Lenore Rosenberg, who
Sure.
um, did casting at the Met for her entire career, and was responsible for a lot of big things in my career. Um, she said to me once. She said to me once, people talk now about the opera art form in all these, siloed skills. Like they say, like, well, she's an amazing actor, but the singing's not very good. Or, my goodness, does he use words incredibly well? I just wish the voice were nice, And we all know who those are probably describing. But Lenore said to me, which I thought was so impactful on me and has really guided me ever since she said it. She said, I remember when I was younger, she said, the singing was the acting. And that's all she said. And that stuck with me so hard because what it meant to me at the time, who know, I hope it's what she intended, but what it meant to me was that the life experience, the Italian diction, the intonation, the quality of the beauty of the sound, the acting, the posture someone uses to create the role of Don Giovanni, the swagger that they might employ, or the demure position for Manon's entrance, whatever their intent, all of these things, the way somebody walks, the way they sing, the way they speak, the way they use French or Italian or whatever, those are all the singing. They are not different skills that you think of compartmentalized as you walk on that stage. They are all the same thing. And one of those major skills is the life experience that you draw upon to create a character that you're portraying. And those, there are times, and so here's an example of the ways in which I've used that technique successfully with young singers at Rice and at the LA Opera, where I was for so many years before Rice. There were times when I would say to somebody who might be struggling with maintaining a tessitura of a difficult phrase, or might be struggling to stay in tune, or there are times, or maybe the delivery of a French line that was particularly complicated was sounding unnative and unconvincing. There are times when you might fix any of those things by just asking them to think a little bit more about the character. And then, an example that I use, another mentor of mine, Richard Beto, who's now back at Houston Grand Opera after having left for a while to go to Rice, back to Houston Grand Opera. Richard Beto,
choral director, I think.
He's actually one of the heads of artistic planning there. So he's doing casting and programming. He's a superstar, and the chorus director. But anyway, he once said to me when I was a student of his at the Houston Grand Opera Studio, he once said to me when I was struggling with the tessitura of a scene in Don Giovanni as Leporello, when I was messing with Mazzetto at the dance, distracting him from what was happening with Zerlina and Don Giovanni in the other part of the stage. And the character of Leporello is constantly telling Mazzetto, "Come on, dance, let's dance. Come on, let's dance." And I, was trying to find the right vowel of ballo and balla, and trying to double the L appropriately, and it wasn't working. And I was kind of getting out of tune, and it was just, in a part of my voice that wasn't my favorite at that moment. And Richard said to me, "Just tell him to dance." And as soon as he said that, it came out glorious, and it was in tune, and I lost nothing from vocal fatigue. I could do that all day, And as soon as so every time I got to that scene in performance, I had Richard's voice in my ear saying, "Just tell the guy to dance." And every time I did that, it came out right. So again, these are not these are not separate from each other. And one of my jobs, I think, is to remind students, even the students who are 23 years old without the life experience of someone like Mimi or Violetta. What I do is I sometimes, remind them that they can find what they're after through a number of avenues. Sometimes what they need is just to be told technically to do something, and all of a sudden they find emotion. Sometimes they need to be told to feel something, and then all of a sudden they find the vocal technique. So not a perfect answer to your question, but it's what occurred to me to respond with.
Okay. Um, I just find it a challenge in part because of the changing mores in our world. And I'm not saying it's the negative. I find, frankly, that we're becoming a lot more open about sexual differences, about personal differences, whatever, which is good. I think it's a great thing. But the friction that happens between two opera characters is often based on the mores of a different time.
True.
And trying to get them to channel back to, let's take Lucia di Lammermoor, who is very much bullied by her brother, and the family's in a bad way financially, and the brother wants her to marry the man that he has picked, the other tenor, because there's money there, whereas Lucia loves a different guy. Number one, most sopranos nowadays wouldn't necessarily be able to understand that their brother is insisting she marry someone else. But number two, that she can't just say, I prefer this guy. And I find myself trying to roll back the years with them and explain what Lucia 200, 300 years ago would experience, and how you can hear it in the music, frankly. And then there's the whole concept of how do you enact insanity, and what is insane, and what is mental health. And because a lot of the characters in the bel canto operas have mad scenes, do we externalize the madness? Do we internalize the madness? And thankfully, a lot of the people I work with don't have that life experience. I'm glad for that. But I find it a challenge in a good way, but just with different operative rules than 15, 20, 25 years ago.
Yeah.
And
Well,
that's what I think about a lot. Yeah.
no. And, I'm reminded of the fact that, sometimes we watch these classic movies from 50 years ago where the style of acting is so dramatically different. The delivery of vocalism in the act, in the, recitation of lines, the diction used feels to us very old fashioned. And then also, there are works, the amazing thing about Broadway is you might go to a very classic production of Sound of Music in one theater and then go to something unbelievably forward thinking and avant-garde like you've never heard before. The one that pops into my mind is this Great Comet of Pierre, the Great Comet, the musical
1918, 1917
that Josh Groban was in, which I thought was so genius. But there was Carousel playing at the theater next to that, and I think that this art form lends itself to the knowledge that we've gained over time. We know more about humanity and about justice, I think, and we're kinder now. And so it's okay for us to revisit some of these pieces through a newer lens. I have to admit, and this will either be received well or poorly, but I'm not a purist when it comes to, if we want to change super titles, if we want to change lyrics, unless it's a protected work that requires, but then get approval. I think it's fine for us to look at some of these works and say that the storylines being told, or the libretti, or the themes require that we use a more sensitive touch based on how we've grown since they were written, or since even a few decades ago. So I'm not a purist. I'm fine with people messing with the production, taking it out of period. I also love occasionally going to a show and seeing just a very classic reenactment of a, 1800s garret in Paris, France, and saying that looks like what Puccini probably thought Bohème was supposed to look like, um, and but I'm also okay going and seeing, the example I always use is I'm okay going and seeing a Bohème set in a butcher shop on the moon. That's fine, if
I saw that one.
you know, if the lens through which we're interpreting it is more contemporary and employs the things we've learned in the last 125 years, then I'm fine with that.
I would just push back a little bit on the projected titles. I understand, for example, the character Monostatos in The Magic Flute, which you guys are doing in the fall, in which another character, I believe Pamina, but I'm not certain, says of him, because he's black or dark-skinned, that your soul is as black as your skin. That's a hateful thing to say. It's awful. And I could see changing that. What I would not want to change, I've seen productions of comedies such as Così fan tutte, in which the language is just made more hip and casual. So that instead of saying, I think she's beautiful, they'll say she's hot, which somehow we don't need to have she's hot with Mozart's music. It doesn't work for me. She's beautiful is fine.
Yeah.
It's not abusive to call someone beautiful, but I've seen bohèmes and cosís that are made very casual, or once in La Traviata I saw, I'd like to make her. No, that's not.
Well, look, I mean, I can tolerate those things, because I guess I feel like going back to the kind of, I'm not sure that people still use Gesamtkunstwerk in the same way that Wagner intended it, but insofar as we think of opera as being the amalgamation of a dozen different, forms of visual and performing and oral arts that come together in order to create something better than each of those individual parts. Insofar as I think, and if I'm wrong about my definition of it, let me know. But that's kind of how I interpret the original intention of that. And so I feel like in the curating of the experience that the audience should have, the projected titles are part of it. The scenery, the costumes, the comfort of the seats, the acoustic in the space, the lighting, the makeup, but of course, first and foremost, the orchestra and the singing. But I'm okay if those other elements are tweaked and modernized, and in order to curate the experience that the director and conductor want the audience to have. If it fails, then it's egg on their face. And if it succeeds, then it's part of this catharsis that we all seek when we go to the theater to see an opera.
The only thing being is that you and I could be attending our 30th Traviata, but someone else may be walking in for the first time. And if they say, I'd like to make her, meaning go to bed with her or whatever, have her, that may not work for that person, whereas you and I can make the distinction.
It's true, but I think when it's done right, I mean, and the example that popped into my head is this Daniel Fish Oklahoma that won the Tony. If you thought you were going to the Oklahoma that your, grandma played you the CD of, or the album of when you were a kid, if that's what you walked into, you might be initially surprised at what you were seeing. But I personally, and everybody that I saw in that theater, had, an experience that was so overwhelming because of how successful it was. So I think, look,
you saw it in New York.
I saw it at before it transferred when it was in Brooklyn. And
was the theater in the Round or no?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. I'm asking because the performance I went to see that Oklahoma, and you're in Texas, by the way. It was a theater in the Round. It's called Circle in the Square. And I was sitting on one side, and opposite me, and I could see her, was the very famous fashion editor, Anna Wintour of Vogue and so on, with her glasses and her coiffed hair and her beautiful clothing. And at the intermission, they served chili and cornbread.
Right.
And the whole world took out their cameras to see if Anna Wintour would eat chili and cornbread. My problem with that production was the smell of the chili and the cornbread all during when they were preparing it. Aunt Eller, I think, was the character who prepared it. And I just couldn't focus on the show
Yeah.
because the smell was so strong. I recently saw a production there of An Enemy of the People, Ibsen's Enemy of the People, which they had herring, that aquavit. It was a little too environmental, or for it was too immersive, and I couldn't focus on either Oklahoma or Norway. And frankly, I did try the chili; it was not very good. That was the other problem.
I didn't have the
So,
chili, but you know what you're mentioning, when sometimes I'm approached by people who don't know our art form or haven't experienced it, and they say, like, what would be a good thing for me to see first? And what I say to them is, it's not really unlike it's not really unlike the art of film. It's, there are certain genres that no matter how popular they are, I'm not even remotely tempted to buy a ticket and go. It's a genre that doesn't appeal to me. It's a type of movie I know I'm not going to get. And and so, I don't even bother going to those unless, maybe I'm, on an airline where it's playing and the curiosity gets the better of me. And I say, I wonder, all my friends loved it. I'll give it a try. And and that kind of thing. But I think the same thing, for theater is, and by that, I'm absolutely, of course, including opera, is, there are certain people who I would recommend, Wozzeck to, and there are certain people that I would say, for the next year or so, stick to whatever. But I will say one thing. There have been times when I've gone to more challenging works and the production and the conducting and the singing were so unbelievable that even newbies and even traditionalists, or even people who I thought of themselves as unlikely to enjoy it, I said, this is a rare opportunity to see something done at an level, whether it's your thing or not. And so if someone I trust tells me that about a film, I'll watch it, even if it's not the movie I envisioned spending my night watching. But so maybe the Daniel Fish Oklahoma is that for you.
yes. So, Josh, I'm sure you and I have many friends in common and colleagues, but one of them I know that we share is the wonderful Nova Thomas, a soprano who is a professor at your school. And she and I are colleagues going back 40 years, even though she doesn't look 40 years older. I certainly do. And she teaches at Rice. And she said to me, I had her on this program a while back, and people can watch it by searching Fred Plotkin, Nova Thomas. And she said, Fred, you have to come down to Houston and see Brockman Hall. And I said, what's Brockman Hall? She said, Brockman Hall, in her North Carolina accent, is the theater that we have at Rice where we do our opera productions. And it's the best theater you'll ever find. So tell me about Brockman Hall. I've not yet been to Houston. I promise I'm coming. But
Well,
tell me about Brockman Hall.
We are so lucky to have, in my estimation, one of the most beautiful opera houses I've ever seen, and I really am not exaggerating when I say that. It was designed with a lot of very specific ambitions and requirements. Ambitions in terms of how it could be used as a laboratory space to train the students that Rice wanted to be going out into the industry. And also, and equally importantly, the experience that the audience was meant to have when they come to see one of the operas at the Shepherd School. So a group of people went to visit the people responsible for the Herculean effort of raising the money and getting the designs and breaking ground and building this incredible jewel box of a space. Did a tour of well-known European theaters and landed on the Royal Opera of Versailles outside Paris as the theater that they felt would best allow what the students needed for their education, which I'll describe. And the ways in which the theater allowed it are: the pit is large enough for any repertoire. So we have an orchestra pit that can accommodate up to 75 players, and while certain things, like if we ever are able to do Die Frau ohne Schatten at Shepherd School of Music, we might have to cut some strings, but
Don't do it.
we might, but other than that, we can do really any repertoire. The auditorium space, the back wall is fairly close, so that there's no seat that's distant from the stage, and it goes up high. It goes up high enough to accommodate the number of seats we wanted, which is between 600 and 700. But there is not a single seat in the theater that doesn't feel very intimately connected to what's happening in the pit and on the stage. And so that means that the space can accommodate repertoire from very small, intimate repertoire, like the origins of the art form, Monteverdi, etc., all the way to, well, Die Frau ohne Schatten, or Peter Grimes, or any of these other enormous pieces written since Monteverdi, so for that reason, the space is conducive to an enormous variety of repertoire, which benefits the students. So that if there are students that if there are a handful of students that come to us and are in particular need of contemporary works, we have the space for it. If they're in particular need of early works, we have the space for it. If they need big romantic, French grand opera or impressionist German repertoire, we have the space for it. Both the acoustic on stage, the orchestra pit, and the auditorium can accommodate all of that. The facility is state of the art in terms of our ability to incorporate new technology like projection and sound design and lighting. Really, having said all that, the most important part, of course, is the student experience. We're very, very lucky that we have I say we're lucky about something that other people might call a challenge, but I like the fact that we are a particularly small department. We have between 32 and 40 students at any given time, and that includes undergraduates and grad students. And so, as you can see, if we're only ever looking at 4 or 5 tenors, let's say, in an entire department at any one time, one tenor deciding to go to another school over ours might derail an entire genre of repertoire. For example, if that one, full lyric Italian tenor says that they're going to a different school, well, then there's no Verdi, no Puccini, for an entire degree time. So we are able to very quickly pivot and say, well, the students that have accepted our offer, which, would benefit from Mozart and Strauss and a large number, and Britten and Stravinsky, and a large number of important works that just simply don't need to employ that one tenor who isn't coming. And so the good thing about that is that it requires us to be so deliberate about what we plan in that space, because it has to be for the 35 students we have in residency at that time. We cannot say 2 years in advance we intend to do a piece for its major anniversary, because when that time comes, those students might not come to Rice. I love that. That might be difficult for some people wanting to plan much further in advance with a major milestone work celebrating a composer's centenary or something. And we just can't do that. But what I love about that is that we have to be much more deliberate and much more specific about the repertoire we present, so that in this incredible space, it's the right education for the students we have.
And that leads to a question that I loosely formulated, but you make it much more concrete. You're doing Mozart's The Magic Flute, October 31st, November 2nd of 2025, and Verdi's wonderful and very complicated Falstaff, on April 17th, 19th, and 21st of 2026. And I asked you, but I would ask your person and your comparable person in any school, um, do you plan the operas based on the singers you have? Do you pick the singers based on the operas you want to do? No, okay. Um, because, for example, the Magic Flute has a small-ish chorus, but it has a lot of principal and secondary roles. Falstaff has, if I recall, 14 different roles, and you need a fantastic, charismatic bass baritone or baritone to play it. I was speaking recently with suddenly blocking his name, Reginald Smith Jr., who's Houston based, who sang Falstaff in Houston as a very young man.
He was
Um,
excellent. Yeah.
yeah. And, but he sort of said to me that he was happy to do it and he loves the role, of course, but he felt young to do it.
Hmm.
And, there are certain kinds of operas and roles that you at the university level, no matter how fine, can't quite do or can't quite do effectively. I know you've done John Corigliano's wonderful Ghost of Versailles, a great modern opera. You did Dido and Aeneas, which is a smaller work and a wonderful work. So I wonder how, if you don't know too much in advance, you look at your singers and say, "This is what we might do." How does that happen?
Yeah, well, there are certain roles, like for example, using the examples of the Magic Flute and Falstaff. There are certain roles, and there may be more than I'm thinking of, but certainly Zarastro, the bass, the soprano queen of the night, and the title role of Falstaff, the baritone, bass baritone. There are certain roles now. You might be able to add Dame Quickly into that group in Falstaff, in being a rare voice type that you got to know you have before you choose a piece. But those four roles, really, the first three I mentioned, kind of quickly as well. I mean, Dame Quickly, not rapidly. Those are the roles, we without those three singers, we certainly would not be doing those titles. And by the way, I want to mention two things. One is because we have this boutique. I feel always like a real estate agent using that term, because what I mean by boutique is we have a very small department. Like when a real estate agent says a house is intimate, what they mean is it's tiny. But so for that reason, I want to say that everybody that comes to Rice is equally eligible for being the person we choose a show for. And so I don't want to put him on the spot, and I don't want to make him uncomfortable, and I won't use his name, but I'll tell you that we're doing Magic Flute because we had the soprano audition for us last audition season in January, and because we have an undergraduate sophomore who can sing Zarastro. And that
Wow.
and that is the truth. Without our 19-year-old undergraduate sophomore, we wouldn't be doing Magic Flute. But that's the kind of flexibility and agility we have in choosing repertoire for our students. Same with the baritone. The baritone singing Falstaff is going to be in his second year, so I had a whole year knowing he was coming back for his second year. So I was able to think for a while in advance, what could we do? And really, every other role in that show, certainly not on the Metropolitan Opera stage, but on the Shepherd School of Music stage, Alice Ford, Ford to some extent, certainly Meg Page, these other roles, I felt very confident that we were going to find those singers. But you're right, without the title role of Falstaff, we wouldn't be doing that show. And I'm reminded when you mentioned Reggie Smith singing Falstaff at HGO, that, David Gockley and then, of course, Patrick Summers, who were, so inspirational to me as a young artist growing up at HGO. They were known for trusting artists, and they still do. I mean, for example, when I was in my second year of the Houston Grand Opera Studio, I sang Osmin in Abduction from the Sorrel main stage. And there are many examples of that. I know that recent young artists have sung the roles of, like, for example, Gilda in Rigoletto while they were young artists, So Houston Grand Opera has a long tradition of trusting singers and knowing that they were not going to just be okay, but that they were going to have enormous successes in roles, even if they themselves thought, this is a little soon for me, but
Yeah.
but they have a coaching staff and a conductor like Patrick who's able to kind of take young artists through experiences like that, not just healthy and not just surviving, but also thriving. So since I was a young artist at Houston Grand Opera with that as my model, I think I bring some of that to Rice.
Will you be doing Magic Flute in English or German?
We're doing it in German. I There were two challenges that I spoke to our incredible director, R.B. Schlatter, who
Yeah.
comes for his second production at Rice. R.B., there was a New York Times write-up of his incredible work in the Hudson Valley, and
Great.
he's so sensational. And so I spoke to him and I said, look, there are two things I'm not imposing any kind of artistic criteria on what you envision, but I said, I just want to talk to you a little bit about the dialogues. I think it's important we do Magic Flute in German, but the German dialogues is always known as just being an enormous burden. It takes, there's a valuable lesson in learning how to speak and pronounce German like that, but it takes up a huge amount of time. And we're doing Magic Flute right when the students arrive, so we don't really have that time. And I also don't want to go back and forth toggling between German and English so that you hear the singing in German and the speaking in English. That's a strange experience to me for an audience. And so I just said, look, I don't have any answers, but that's what I've come up with is I don't know how to solve this problem. And he said, let's cut the dialogue. I'd like to have, he said, and I hope I'm not disclosing anything that he wouldn't authorize, but Magic Flute was the first opera he heard as a young child, and he always envisioned that opera as being through the eyes of a young child. And so he thought, why don't we have a young child narrator filling in the blanks between musical numbers so that the entire experience for the audience is this child experiencing Magic Flute, and therefore it being a proxy for us to experience it in the same way. And I thought that was so genius in a typical RB genius way. And so that's the solution we've come up with in terms of how to not tackle the enormous undertaking of hours and hours of dialogue in German, but also being able to do the piece in its native language.
So as we conclude, as I said, I really do want to come to Houston. I'm not angling for an invitation, but I really do want to come to Houston. And one of the reasons I want to come is the Johnson Space Center. I love aeronautics and space exploration, all that, and love what that means to Houston and so on. And you were talking before about La Boheme Set on the Moon, and there really was such a production in Paris, which I saw. I don't know if you saw it or were in it. But I'm wondering if there is a connection, given the technology and science focus of Rice University. To what degree in the city, I've not been there, is an awareness of Houston being a space capital in addition to being a cultural capital, a petroleum capital, a wonderful eating city, from what I gather, Vietnamese food and not only, barbecue, of course. But is it a presence in the city? And is it a presence at Rice?
Absolutely. Well, I mentioned earlier just the kind of overwhelming cultural offerings of this place, and the Space Center I omitted in error, but it's certainly a major one. And then to kind of go back to what I was saying about, President DeRoche of Rice University and his unveiling of this 10-year plan, part of which is becoming a real leader in kind of cultural collaboration with various institutions within Houston. So, I see that what we can do at the Shepherd School to support his vision for the university is we certainly need to be looking at the ways in which these other cultural partners in Houston, can lend what they offer to the training of artists. And I've had Houston has a huge, energy, gas and energy industry. So I've had geology professors at Rice say to me, like we should have coffee and talk about the ways in which what's the intersectionality between performing arts and geology. And if you look hard enough, there certainly will be one. There's the medical center here, the space center here.
Yeah.
Look at the amazing work Renee Fleming has been doing with music and the brain. I think she's been doing lots and lots of projects that have to do with the ways in which I think it's Parkinson's or Alzheimer's and the way that music affects the brain.
I'll explain to you a little bit off camera, but I've been very involved in that as well.
Oh, okay, great. And it's so, there's so much.
A lot of it happens at Mount Sinai, which hospital in New York, which has the best center in America, allegedly, for cognitive issues and the treatment of the old and the care of the old. And I take care of such a person. And she came recently in May to Mount Sinai, and I was there, and there was an event, and we explored that whole topic. So, yeah.
Well, look, I mean, I remember, LA Opera, who had this incredible director of community outreach, Stacy Brightman, who's now at the Abell Theater in LA. And Stacy pioneered an effort with her colleagues at USC Health to have singers during COVID go in and work with sick patients struggling with breathing on vocal techniques to improve breath. So the arts and science and medicine and space and engineering and architecture, they all overlap. And I think that it's inspiring to work at a place where the president of our university is really committed to finding the spaces in which all these things overlap.
Joshua Winograde, they're lucky to have you. You have only further whetted my appetite for discovering the opera scene in Houston, of which the Shepherd School at Rice University is a big part. And I thank you very much for joining me today.
Brett, it's been a real pleasure. I've loved talking to you.